All right,
Yeah.
we're at 2 past the hour here, so that means that it's time to jump in. Welcome everyone to the marketing measurement coffee break brought to you by Recast. Hopefully everyone's having a great December and is looking forward to a nice restful break. As a reminder, our promise to you in these sessions is we'll keep this fast-paced and informative. The idea is to try to just deliver a lot of really interesting, useful information to y'all as quickly as possible. And two, we will not pitch our respective companies during the next 30 minutes. You will get an email from us with some links to Recast and some information about Power Digital and our LinkedIn's, but for the most part, we're just going to be really trying to focus on being as helpful and useful as we can. Once we get into the content, we'll start having a conversation. We would love for people to drop questions that they have, follow-ups, places where you want to dig deeper into the chat. So that way we can make sure to keep this as relevant for everyone as possible. So with that, let's jump in. So super excited to welcome Ben Dutter to the coffee break here. Ben is one of the best people to follow on LinkedIn, in my opinion. He puts out consistently great content, super thoughtful, super helpful, practical advice for marketers thinking about measurement and strategy and tactics, the whole range, really. He has extensive performance marketing experience, both on the agency and the brand side, and he's now the Chief Strategy Officer at Power Digital. So welcome, Ben.
Yeah, thanks, Michael. Great to be here. And like we were talking before we started, nothing but love and respect for the Recast team. So happy to be here.
Amazing. Well, with that, let's jump in. So first question I want to ask you is, what are the most common mistakes you see brands making when it comes to marketing effectiveness management, or when it comes to marketing effectiveness measurement?
Yeah, I think that the most common for sure, which is probably no surprise to the folks on this call, is measuring through some sort of deterministic attribution. That's flaw number one, most common. What I actually think, though, is more deadly is not looking at the P&L. And I was actually just on a call this morning with a client that is losing money on every customer that they're bringing in because they've never looked at median cohorted LTV to CAC. And factoring in all the costs and getting to an actual margin number. And that to me is step one. If you can't track that and you can't, hold yourself to a profit matrix or whatever your business objectives are, then you shouldn't even care about measurement or marketing yet.
What do you think are the blockers to that? Is it people who just haven't run a business before, and so they're not used to looking at the right reports in QuickBooks, or like what is driving that?
I think it's the confusion around customer economics versus revenue economics and the distinction between what cohorts of your audience are highly valuable versus more typical. And so for them, their average LTV was skewed way up by a small cohort of super loyal champions who bought 5 times as much as their normal customer. But when you look at their median or their mode customer, they're actually underwater. So I think it's the data infrastructure to get to that information, and then just the analytical chops to separate that apart. And as a business, blended overall, they were about break even, but they were confused. Like, we should be making a lot more money than we are, but it's because so many of their customers were low value, one and done.
Fascinating. That's a tough problem to deal with. Like, I feel like there's a lot of like mobile games and some specific industries that have this like whale thing where it's like their distributions are really skewed by a few super high valuable customers, and then figuring out the economics of like, how do you get paid back? What are this? It feels really tough to me, honestly. Like, it's not as easy as if you're or like an e-commerce shop with one hero product where it's like it's pretty easy to generalize across the whole range.
Totally. Yeah, it starts to crop up a lot with either subscription-based businesses or businesses that have a really diverse SKU set. They have, hundreds or thousands of SKUs. There's going to be a wide range of customer value.
So you and I think both sort of advocate that people not overly fixate on in-platform marketing and reporting metrics. But I'm curious, like, what are your thoughts on like, when is it a good time to look at those metrics, or what should you use that for? And then what shouldn't you use those in-platform reporting metrics for?
Yeah, I'm a big fan of diversified measurement, using a kind of a prioritization framework around, what data point do I use to make what type of decision? And platform metrics to me, like let's just stick with Meta ads, I think is probably the most common, or Google ads, right? Those two for e-commerce at least. I look at in-platform attributed ROAS and things like that to make intra-platform decisions. So if I'm within a situation where I have 10 ads in a prospecting campaign, I will look at the platform results of those ads specifically to determine which ad is winning in this category, which ad do I think I can scale, but I don't affect the overall Meta budget. I'm not adding more money to Meta because the platform ROAS looks good, right? I look at the P&L, I look at some other sort of holistic measurement methodology like MMM or incrementality testing, and that is more of a strategic decision. And so you need a strategic measurement methodology to answer those questions and make those decisions. Whereas a tactical, technical decision day to day, I'm an ad buyer optimizing my ads, you can look in that small of a scale and it's likely not to hurt your business overall.
That makes a lot of sense. And you just mentioned that, this idea of like a framework for what you look at to answer what type of question. And I've seen you post a couple of times on LinkedIn about these different frameworks that you have. Can you sort of talk about the like your sort of core advice for talking to CMOs, marketing leaders who are trying to figure out how do we pull these different pieces together and what should we look at for answering what type of question?
Yeah, for sure. I think a lot of it depends on the maturity of the business. If you're like a 7-figure brand, all I really care about is, am I growing up and to the right? And is my unit economics profitable or within the tolerable ranges of my investment? That's it. I don't need crazy MMM. I don't need crazy incrementality tests. The likelihood that my media is incremental is very high when you're that small of a business. And so if you're investing and you're not growing, it's probably a fundamental flaw somewhere in your strategy, your business strategy. Either your product doesn't have product market fit, or your marketing is really flawed inherently, and you don't need a lot of measurement to tell you that. It's like you should be able to feel it as a owner operator. When you start to get more mature though, let's say, in the low to eight mid figures, like 25 to 50 million, that's where I start to see a lot of brands hit a plateau. And they've diversified into 3 or 4 channels. They have a healthy amount of repeat customers. They maybe have multiple revenue streams, like they're sold on bricks and clicks and third party retail. And they start to get kind of confused around what is cannibalization, what is synergy, what is incremental, what is not. And so at that maturity stage is when you really want to start doing that validation process. And I like acronyms, and I follow an acronym called BEATS, which is a priority business experiment analysis tracking surveys. And a lower letter in that acronym should never supersede a decision from a higher letter in that acronym. So business fundamentals, business economics always take priority over everything else. Experiments are next. So that's your incrementality validation. Analysis, which is like MMM or causal impact or similar data science led models, should take next. Tracking is next. And then surveys is a cherry on top, an interesting kind of way to collect directional data, knowing that it's very flawed and biased based on, human memory is terrible. So using that framework, though, I can very quickly say, hey, I have a business P&L problem, but my tracking looks great. Which would you prefer? Well, I don't care what
fix the business first.
Yeah, I don't care what Meta is telling me about my ROAS. I care about what my P&L is telling me, right? So that's sort of the prioritization framework I recommend for clients.
I love that framework, honestly. And I think, we advocate for a similar way of thinking about the world at Recast. I'm curious, we talk to a lot of brands that are sort of dipping their toes into experiments and dipping their toes into sort of more sophisticated analysis like MMM or whatever it's called. And there's often this problem where the business has been so trained to look at like either a last touch ROAS or first touch ROAS or even in platform ROAS that like getting them to shift can be really difficult. Have you experienced that problem? And like, what advice do you have for marketers that are trying to move their organization sort of to higher levels of this marketing analysis pyramid, let's call it?
Yeah, every day. I would say that's probably my main job is explaining to CFOs how marketing measurement works and the things that they need to look at. I probably talk to, I don't know, 10 to 15 CMOs a week and just as many CMOs because of that. And it's getting better, actually, which is interesting. I've seen it over the last couple of years, sort of the post iOS 14 fallout has made it more prevalent where people understand terms like incrementality and contribution, not attribution, things like that. But it still is a very recurring topic. And so the advice that I have usually is to prove it out in a small scale experiment and just, try to find a way that you can validate that directionally. The easiest way is, hey, give me a couple of days even, or a couple of weeks to turn media off that is highly quote unquote performant based on your attribution method. Classic example is brand search, right? But brand search has its place. But let's just say, hey, CFO says, I want to pump more money into brand search. And you're, as the marketer, saying, no, this is not incremental. This is not incremental. Pick a portion of the country and turn brand search off in that portion of the country and monitor total sales, not attributed, but total sales. And chances are it'll have a very negligible negative impact with no brand search. And you can tell the CFO at that point, look, I just saved all this money from brand search in this area. Clearly, there's no negative impact downstream, at least in the short term. Let's try it out elsewhere. So having that kind of baby step of let me prove it, rather than let's just trust some other biased data set is an easy way, especially if it's saving money. CFOs want to be profitable usually. So that's an easy sell. It's like, hey, it's not going to cost you anything. In fact, it'll cost you less. And if all of a sudden the fear is, well, if we turn off our marketing, our revenue is going to fall through the floor. It's like, well, if that happens, if we turn it off and 2 days later, you're down 25% day over day in revenue, turn it back on. But we got the answer that we wanted. You know, you don't have to be too academic or precious with your experiments when you're at just that early validation stage. When you're mature and everybody's bought into it across the institution and you're talking about incrementality to the board, that's when you really got to be careful. But just those early days of like waking people up to the reality, you don't need to be super academic with it.
I love that. I think I agree that like I think sometimes people get too fixated on like how do we run the perfect experiment, and it's like you don't actually have to do that. There's a whole range of things that you can do in between nothing and the most perfect precise experiment you could possibly run that can give you information and signal. And like, okay, that can be useful for just making, you know, one, optimizing towards a better overall mix, and then two, being able to like make a case and convince people like, look, if branded search were really super effective, we would have seen a big drop and we didn't. We saw a small drop. And so what does that tell us? And then you can use that to go and make other decisions and run other similar types of experiments, even if they're not like perfect randomized controlled trials.
Exactly. Yeah. I think there's been a generation of really deeply analytical people who, and creative people, honestly, who love to work on the work rather than love working on the mission or the outcome. And I think that people get that confused a lot. And I even with teams that I work with on a daily basis, I'm like, will this require a data scientist to explain? Then the chances are we're not doing it right. We're getting too in our own head. It needs to be self-evident to a layperson of what the results are. And that's what the test needs to be. And maybe the test is more aggressive than or sloppier, or there's other noise in the model. But we live in reality, and so we have to operate within reality.
I think that makes a lot of sense and it's great advice. Juan in the chat brought up this question about like, okay, you know, if you want to do this turning off marketing in one channel in part of the country, like there is an opportunity cost, right? Potentially you end up losing those sales, and depending on the stage of your business, that can be tough. What I often say is like, well, one, like you can go the other direction. Like we can take a channel and increase spend in half of the country and see what happens and get a similar analysis. I'm curious, you know, CFOs often do want to save money, but do you ever get that pushback on like, oh man, we're too scared. We can't deviate from the plan. What if we lose sales and then we miss the target that we've promised the board? And how do you like have that conversation?
Yeah, you tolerate what is the information that we're willing to say. So I look at it from a percentage of revenue. Let's say that the business is spending 5% of their revenue back on brand search. So that's the total kind of loss of revenue towards profit is 5%. So let's find a market that's less than 5% of revenue for the business and turn brand search off just in that market. Worst case scenario, we lose 5% of revenue, but we saved 5% of cost. Fine. And so you just have to kind of do that power analysis of what is the worst case scenario and game it out. And like I said earlier, if all of a sudden you're 2 days into the experiment and your sales fall off a cliff, turn it back on. I don't want to hurt the business at all, but we got the information that we needed. You don't have to wait 60 days just because your data science person said to. You can clearly see the line dropping if it is incremental, but I can tell you in the 600 plus tests I've done of that nature, maybe 10% show that. So it's usually much more of a slow gradual decline. And this is where like ad stocking and latency and consideration cycles and all those things come into play. So it's usually a lot less violent than brands suspect it will be.
Totally. I want to change the topic a little bit. So you have a background in performance marketing, but there's also, this other type of marketing called brand, and I'm putting it in scare quotes because it sort of means different things to different people. What's your perspective on brand marketing? When should brands do it? What brands should do it? Well, let's start with there, and then we can talk about like how should you measure it and how should you think about it.
Yeah, it's coincidental. I actually posted about this on my LinkedIn this morning, right before this call. So there's a trend right now in D2C for a lot of businesses to position into brand marketing, quote unquote. And I think it's kind of a misnomer. I think that there is no such distinction between any form of marketing. Marketing is marketing, and marketing's job is to generate revenue. It's either generating it now or later. That's all marketing is. Marketing is sales at scale, period. I'll fight anybody who says otherwise. And so brand, then what a brand is actually the way that customers view your business when you're not in the room, so to speak. It's your reputation. And so that's everything beyond marketing too. That's the product quality. That's the customer service. That's your packaging. That's your return policy. That's your pricing. Everything about it, which you could argue a lot of those elements are part of marketing, right? But there's this like trend right now, a lot of brands I work with that say, hey, we want to build a brand. Help us do a brand budget. Help us do a brand campaign strategy. And it's like, that's 5% of what a brand is the marketing. All that is communicating the point of view that you have. And step one, you got to have a point of view. If you don't, then you're just wasting your money and you're buying ineffective media. Now, I think in a lot of cases, upper funnel media can be bought in reach and frequency type models like TV, audio, podcasts, YouTube, even on Meta, TikTok, etc. That can be highly incremental. And I've proven that many, many times over. And it looks terrible from a platform ROAS perspective. And it's because of the time and the consumer journey. All ads in digital are exactly the same. They're an impression. That's it. And so whether it's a brand medium or a performance medium, they start as an impression. And that's where I would argue 90 to 95% of the value comes from anyway, whether or not that person clicked on it. Seeing the ad is what actually changed their behavior, whether it's incremental or not.
So I think so I totally agree. I think it's important, like people get confused and talk in circles a lot. I think when they talk about brand, because they sort of split out the strategy, they don't effectively split out the strategy from the medium. Like you can run ads on TV, which some people call like a brand media, a linear TV, right? Some people call a brand medium, but you can run them in a very direct response way, right? Like I'm sure we all remember like seeing these ads on TV. It was like, call now, buy the whatever the onion chopper thing. Like that is a direct response ad on linear TV. And you can still, and there's a spectrum, right, between like the most direct response and sort of quote unquote brand oriented advertising that maybe doesn't show the product as much or do whatever. There's a whole spectrum there. And you can drive sales today through mediums like that. It's just a matter of one, thinking about like, what is our strategy? What are we actually trying to get consumers to do? Is it to purchase? Is it to think positively about us and remember us when they're at the shelf, or is it something else? And then two, thinking about how are we actually going to measure that? Because as you mentioned, like these channels can be highly incremental in the short term. We've also seen it at Recast demonstrated multiple different ways, but we often see people getting confused where they're like, we want to run TV ads and we think that we, should run TV ads the same way that like Nike does. And it's like, that's probably not actually the right move for you if you're not at the same scale as Nike. Like Nike's just in a very different position in the market. They've been around for so long. They're the biggest brand in the world. Like you as a new upstart need to be doing something slightly different. And a lot of times what you want to be doing is getting people to buy your product, because that's what actually influences their perception of the brand, is their use of the product and their friends' use of the product more than anything else.
Exactly. Yeah. And I think, a lot of people find this controversial, but if you're struggling to scale to mid 8 figures on traditional quote unquote digital performance channels, you probably have a product market fit issue. I've had many brands sleepwalk into 9 figures. They literally don't even know what the heck they're doing, and they get into 100, 200, 300, $400 million strictly off of Meta and Google. So because of the strength of their product and the natural kind of fractal effect or viral effect that people bring in, they speak so highly of the product. They recommend it to all their friends. Influencers make content about it for free. It's all the rage. It develops word of mouth. That is a much stronger quote unquote brand strategy than any amount of TV buying could be.
I think that's totally right. I totally agree. We got a good question here from Timothy about trust and communication on one side, and I guess friction on the other between like the data analysis team and then marketing ops C-suite. The data analysis team will try to make an argument and the marketing team doesn't really buy it. There's friction there. You're nodding your head like you've seen this before. How do you think about like working through that and getting people onto this journey of making those teams work better together and being able to deliver value for the business overall?
Yeah, there's two things. I think it's culture and communication. So if the culture is toxic, where you don't have a system where the whole company is bought into a growth mindset, experimenting, being wrong, being able to improve and learn, then it doesn't matter how sound your analysis is or how great your experiments are. If people are going to be stubborn and obstinate and not want to open their mind to it, then it doesn't matter, right? So, but let's say that you're there and your whole team is hugs and kisses and everybody has a good culture, then it's the data scientist's job to explain the technical field. And that's an issue that I've had is the joke that I make internally is data scientists only know how to convince other data scientists. They're so technical in they're too technical for their own good, right? And it's like, use no word that has more than 2 syllables in it when you explain this to the team, and do a little diagram for them with crayons if you have to. Like if it's the data scientist's job to dumb it down to the nth degree in their perception, but even still, that's probably too sophisticated for most people. So it comes back to, if the culture is good, then you just have to say, hey, here's an experiment I want to run. Don't worry too much about the methodology. Success will look like revenue goes up in this market. Failure looks like it's flat or down. Give me 2 weeks. Here's how much it'll cost. Here's what I think the revenue upside is. Do you trust me? Yep. Okay, let's go do it. And then you can both go look at the data together. And is it up? Then you're good. If it's not, then the experiment failed. And that's okay because you have the culture to do that. So it's around it's the purview of the more technical specialist to always educate to the level of their audience.
I totally agree with that. It's definitely a real challenge. And like I have had this challenge throughout my career. Like I'm a data scientist by training, and I always want to like give all the caveats, and they're like, okay, there's this much uncertainty. And it's been a real journey for me trying to figure out like, okay, how do I get people to take the right action, the thing that actually matters, give them enough information so that they're fully informed without like bogging them down with like all of the fully academic explanations, which just aren't actually helpful. They make me feel good and feel smart, but they aren't actually helpful for the business and driving the business forward.
Exactly. Yeah. It's money up, money down. That's what we care about, right? That's the job of business. So it's that simple.
I think another thing that was implicit in what you just said, which I think is really insightful and really powerful, is like driving towards an experiment. It's like, hey, the data scientist has done some analysis and that's great. And there's some insight there, but then that data scientist needs to be driving towards an experiment. We have a suspicion about something, and then now we need to go prove it in a way that will be very dead obvious. And that I think also makes it helps the data scientist like avoid having to explain the very complicated analysis they did to get to that insight, and then roots it in how are we actually going to connect this to the business in a really dumb, simple way. And so I think that's also really powerful, and a good thing. Like a lot of data scientists or statisticians that come from an academic background, like they don't always realize that like, actually, wait, we work in a business. We can control these levers. We can go run experiments on a bunch of different things. They're used to being like, I'm going to get a data set, I'm going to run an analysis, and then I'm going to publish a report. And that's where my job ends. And so I think a very good thing for people who are in this role to be thinking about is how can we drive towards experiments that really make things crystal clear and super obvious for the business. That way you don't have to worry about explaining the complicated methods that you got there. If the experiment works, then thumbs up, great, and you've really helped to drive the business forward. Cool. We've maybe got time for one more question here. Okay, so here's a good one. How do you think about like doing these experiments or doing this sorts of analysis when you have these different lengths of time shift for different types of media or even different types of businesses, right? Some businesses, you turn off brand search and you see the effect tomorrow or not. Other businesses that can be sort of a much longer time period if there's a longer consideration window. How do you think about doing this sort of work in that context? It's a little bit more difficult to measure because of the longer consideration window or buying cycle.
Yeah, I mean, there's not an easy answer, unfortunately. The classic marketing answer is any experiment should last 2 consideration cycles. So if you know intuitively or you've done qual research or something where your product has a 15-day consideration cycle, then an experiment should last 30 days at least. That's the like classic rule of thumb. Right now, a lot of brands don't know how long their actual consideration cycle is. So the way that I do it is turn the experiment on and let it run with no intentional cutoff date until performance stabilizes. And when the performance stabilizes, that is the quote unquote end or the full saturation of the experiment. And for a lot of brands, it's actually a lot shorter than they think. They're like, oh, our product is really expensive and it's a 6-month or 12-month consideration cycle. And it's like, is it really? And we run an experiment, and in 45 days, the market effect is down to basically zero from marketing. So, that's where I think having the willingness, again, it comes back to the culture of an experiment led mindset, the willingness to just turn something on and let it run and see what happens, let the mold grow in the petri dish kind of indefinitely until there's no new information.
I think those tips are super on point and practical. And I wish that we had time to dig into this more, because I think a lot of marketers get confused about consideration cycle and then effective advertising length, which are actually two different, they're related, but two very different concepts and very important to keep in mind. But we are out of time. And as always, we want to be super respectful to our audience. Thank you all so much for joining. Thanks for all of the great questions. And thank you very much to Ben for being on with us. Things to do, check out Power Digital, powerdigitalmarketing.com. Give Ben a follow on LinkedIn. Also follow me if you're not already there. And then make sure to sign up for our next coffee break with Casey Johnson. She's been, I think, at a bunch of these. We're super excited to have her. She's been active in the chat. It's going to be a great conversation in January. And then in the meantime, happy holidays, happy new year to everyone. And good luck closing out the end of the year, making the most of Q4. All right. Thanks, everybody. Really appreciate it.
Thanks, team.